My name is Kiho Kim. I am the chair of the Department of Environmental Science at American University. I teach a range of classes, including Introduction to Environmental Science, all the way up to graduate level classes in environmental science. The paper is about an idea that we had trying to understand how nitrogen pollution has changed over time. So for much of human agricultural history, we used to use naturally degraded materials for fertilizer, everything from decomposing plant matter all the way up to human sewage. So nitrogen is a very important element. It's very important for growth of plant material in particular, and so we use nitrogen to fertilize our gardens, we fertilize our lawns. People use it to fertilize golf courses, so it's incredibly green and lush. And we also use nitrogen to fertilize our crops, so everything from soybeans to corn to spinach, what have you. It requires a lot of nitrogen. It also requires other things, but nitrogen in particular. Now, in the early part of the 1900s, a couple of people came up with the idea of making fertilizer chemically. It required huge amounts of energy, but you can make nitrogen fertilizer by taking it out of the air and turning it into fertilizer. We know that nitrogen is an important pollutant in ocean water. Oceans tend to be very low in nitrogen, and because of human activity, nitrogen has been flowing into the oceans in increasing amounts and causing some very significant changes to ocean ecosystems. There are a couple of questions that remain outstanding. One is, how bad has it gotten? So historically, how bad has it been and how bad is it getting now? So that was one of the questions we wanted to address with this research paper. The second question was, has the type of nitrogen pollutant changed over time? So what's getting into the coastal seas and how much it has been increasing over the last 50 or even 100 years. Well, in order for us to address those sets of questions, we had to go back in time, and obviously we can't do that. And so what we did was we looked at things that were living back in time. And so, for example, the Smithsonian Institution has a museum with lots of coral samples that have been collected by past scientists. And so we went back and collected pieces of corals that lived at different times in the history of the Caribbean. Not very long history, but over the last 150 years or so. And so by sampling those corals that lived 150 years ago and 140 years ago, we can try to figure out, number one, whether or not nitrogen pollution was increasing, and number two, what kind of nitrogen was coming into the ocean, because there are two kinds of nitrogen in essence. One is the nitrogen that comes from fertilizer, the stuff that we use for growing food, and the second type, which we as humans and animals create, urine. Those kinds of, that's another source of nitrogen that may ultimately enter the ocean as well. And so those are the two basic questions. How bad is it getting, and what is contributing to the nitrogen pollution? So the most important part of the research was to collect samples, or at least get access to samples. The Smithsonian houses samples that have been collected for the last couple hundred years, and so we were fortunate to have given access to some of those samples, coral samples. And so over a period of a couple of months, we went down, we looked at the database of the specimens that they had. I and a couple of graduate students went down and over that period snipped off very small pieces of corals, which were then turned into powder by simply grinding them and then analyzing them using a stable isotope analyzer. And so we can ascertain, or we can figure out, whether or not the nitrogen that was captured or taken up by the coral came mostly from fertilizer or mostly from sewage material. Half of the nitrogen that we apply simply washes into the ocean. Maybe we can be smarter about how we apply nitrogen onto our crops, onto our golf courses, onto our front lawns, and so forth. So that's one set of plans for mitigating that source of nitrogen. If it's a human sewage problem, then we need to upgrade water treatment plants. We need to make sure that these wonderful and glorious hotels that are lining the shorelines of the islands throughout the Caribbean, or for that matter in the Florida Keys, we need to make sure that those hotels, those housing developments, are really well plumbed and that the wastewater that they generate is cleaned up before it gets dumped back into the ocean. Because right now, in many places, a lot of the wastewater simply gets pumped down into the ground, which eventually make their way back out onto the coral reef. And so we need to know, is it development and human sewage-derived nitrogen, or is it fertilizer? Obviously, in many places, it's both. but we need to know the relative importance of those two sources of nitrogen so that we can make plans, prioritize, and that sort of thing, so that we can put up a much more effective plan for mitigation and remediation.